Hi everyone, this is Mark from Solo Games, and today we're going to talk about some recommendations, tier list if you will. Everyone likes tier lists, sorry, top 5 everything. Top 5 moms, stuff like that. Anyways, okay. It's like 25 seconds, guys. We're gonna get the advertisers, really pissed off, all right? Stay classic, stay classy for the next, 30 seconds, and then we can get into the real stuff. Anyways, today we're going to talk about the alternatives for Magic the Gathering. Why? Well, because I'm tired of Magic, and probably a lot of you guys are. So instead of us bitching about Magic every week, let's talk about what other games we could be playing that's not Magic, or honestly, even other games that you may have missed out because you've been so devoted to Magic, and this is such a great time to go and try something different, right? And I'm not saying you're gonna quit Magic, sell everything, and then get a new wife and girlfriend, but I'm just saying maybe it's time to go check out what the options are on the market and what kind of games you've been missing out. So even if we take a short break, let's explore options, okay? Again, what I want to do on this tier list is basically give you a set of different games that are paper only. I don't want to give you digital games. There's a lot of good ones out there that's alternatives, and you probably already know about them. But today we're going to focus on paper, which is going to be easily the most translatable from Magic over to something else. And if for those of you guys like me who are crazy and want to actually see real people and then play with real cards or something, insane, right? This is equivalent exchange for things that you've been kind of used to. You don't have to go you don't have to stay in your comfort zone, if you will, okay? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the different options here. So number 5, we have Piece TCG. Now, I say this, and I'm really tempering expectations here, okay? So I have not really played this game. I have watched some gameplay online. So please take my recommendation as just with lots of grains of salt. In fact, dunk a tub of salt on me, probably, right? Just make sure. It's a relatively new card game, which usually means it's pretty exciting, which means meta is not set in stone, which means that there's a lot of things to figure out for all the players, which is cool, right? And as far as I can tell, there's a lot of stores that support it, which is cool. This is the whole idea. You want games that have a lot of store support where you can go to your local LGS and just play the game. You don't have to drive 1,000 miles and see if you have some players who want to play. A lot of stores I go to, there are players who are talking about this game, who are kind of running locals, which running weekly or bi-weekly at local events, which is really cool. Card availability for this game is pretty high because the whole idea of the altar system. So in Piece TCG, the chase is these alternate art and other super rare cards. So the normal cards, right, the normal versions you need to play at the game is actually relatively available, which means essentially you can go out there, build a deck for very cheap. That's top tier meta decks, no problem, right? Not like other card games like Magic where, Shieldra, it's $75. So if you need 4 of them, you're going to be running $300, almost $300 something for Shieldra for just 4 cards, which are core to every deck now. And if you want a One Ring, it's $40. You know what I mean, right? There's a lot of these issues with Magic where cards are locked behind a paywall, whereas in other card games, some of the meta cards even are very available because, well, there's alternative versions. That's where the other players are going to chase after. And because of that, the collectability for this card game is pretty high. It's very, standard Japanese card game where there's hyper rarities and all the things that Magic is starting to learn now are all the things that these Japanese cards games has been doing for decades. Okay, hyper, super rare, super crazy treatments, etc. All that stuff is in there. And worst case scenario, if you're an anime fan, right, you like One Piece, this is a cool thing to collect. So. And One Piece, I believe, is one of the, if not the longest running and continuously still running anime / manga from Shonen Jump from years ago. We're talking Naruto, Bleach days. One Piece was around. So there you go. Okay, number 4 on our list is going to be Lorcana. Now, Lorcana is also super new. In fact, I think it's the newest one on our list because it just came out. The actual release happened last week. In general, right, look, it's a Disney game. So again, if you don't like the artwork, I totally get it. I'm not also a big fan of this either. Super new game, and you know how I feel about new games. In general, if the game's well designed, it has a lot of basically ways for you to go figure out new meta. That's always fun to be part of a new game. So just kind of being there, nobody knows what's going on. Everyone's trying to bumble through it and figure things out as you go. From what I hear, Lorikan is very simple to play. It's much simpler than games like Magic Gathering, other games like that. So it's really great game for maybe like you and your kids and your family to go learn, because again, you don't want games that are too complicated, where the skill curve is too high, where some players may feel like they're at a disadvantage. This is why, for younger kids, I prefer to play games that are a little bit more random. And then for people who are really into like competitive gaming, you want to play games with less randomness. So this is the whole like, do you roll dice or do you play chess type of skill, right? Loricana kind of feels like more of a children's card game, which makes sense. It's a Disney card game, so it's something that you may have a lot of fun playing with your kids, right? And they might just have a lot of fun collecting Disney characters, etc., things that they already know, so it's kind of cool. That's basically what I have to say about Loricana. Now, for your more like spiky players, the people who are more interested in a deep card game, I do think from the surface, Loricana has some problems where the game does look too simple. Future sets could fix this issue. Again, it's a living TCG, so essentially it could be different in the future. But for now, it's a very simple card game. And yeah, so there's that. There's some benefits to that, but again, that could have been okay back in 1994. The problem is we are in 2023. There are a lot of card games out there. There are a lot of mechanics that players who play these games are expecting. So for Loricana to come out to be a more simple game is a problem for those players. So something to think about. Okay, number 3, and some of you guys might be surprised about this, is actually going to be Sorcery TCG. Now, why do I say Sorcery is a number 3 contender for our alternatives to Magic? Well, because exactly that. I want to provide alternatives for Magic players, not just for any card game, okay? We're not ranking card games, we're ranking alternatives to Magic the Gathering. Sorcery, artwork, all those pieces are exactly what Magic the Gathering used to be, should be today, but it isn't anymore. So for the people who really like those kind of things, the gritty artwork from the darker feeling, right? Like really descending into dungeons, that kind of stuff, Sorcery is the game for you, at least artwork-wise. And then as far as the actual gameplay goes, right, there are a lot of things that I have issues with. I think Sorcery can get very complicated as a game, and there are a lot of places where you can make mistakes and you could regret steps much, much later in the game. The memory issue is a problem. However, I do think from a gameplay perspective, it does open up new horizons. And I think and this totally makes sense because one of the owners of Sorcery, designers, is a person who was really heavily involved in Path of Exile, right? And Sorcery has this feeling of a map atlas to me, right? So if you play Path of Exile, you know how this works, where basically the end game for Path of Exile is you go through these maps and you can modify them, you can change them, etc. And there's a bunch of like these planes, if you will, that you can like do battle on, and they have different modifiers for your character, for the monsters, etc. So really feels that way in Sorcery, and I can see how that works. And the cool thing about the map, how it works is the map isn't revealed to you in the beginning. You kind of have to put nodes down to reveal the next nodes, exactly how the Sorcery mapping system works too. So there's elements that definitely remind me of Path of Exile. Again, super new game, so the meta is not set, which is a lot of room for exploration. And again, if you like the artwork, if you like those things, that's there. And lastly, of course, collectability, still present in Sorcery. There's going to be your like super rare relics, I think they're called. But basically, they're like super rare cards that are more like fun designer cards, but they're hyper rare inside the actual boxes. So if you open boxes, you can see them. And from what I hear, I have not seen a foil yet, but from what I hear, the foils are very good in Sorcery. Like they look really nice. My only issue with Sorcery right now is I don't see a lot of support from local game stores. I think a lot of game stores are cautious about new card games because, many of them have been burned by MetaZoo and the likes. So they don't want to open up themselves to another card game and potentially be burned again. Now, as more players kind of pick up the game, as the more underground scene grows, I think Sorcery will see more play in different card game stores. And I'd love to go play and check the game out, honestly. But for now, though, Sorcery is a little bit tough to get play groups together. That's one of the things I would say downsides for this game is that unless you have a local play group, I don't know if you can really run a bunch of Sorcery games. I don't see any locally to me, and I do have a lot of like Magic game stores around here. So, okay. Number 2, and I don't think anyone's going to be surprised about this, maybe just surprised that it's number 2, is going to be Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood is a old school card game, right? And I say old school because it's a old new card game. So Flesh and Blood came out in, it must have been 2019. And that was when the first set, Welcome to the Wraith, came out. A lot of people were super excited about this game, all that stuff. And then, of course, they've had many, many expansions since then, and the game is still growing strong. So these are all good signs for the card game. Now, the game has changed a lot. There's more creatures involved in the game, at least in the last meta. And of course, it's supposed to be based on the heroes and those kind of things. Now, Flesh and Blood is probably the most different card game, I would say, than any other card games I've seen in the recent history. A lot of card games involve in like playing creatures, playing spells, kind of doing battle with your creatures. Flesh and Blood, at least at the core card game, is really about you doing battle with another human being, with another champion, with another hero. I mean, to the point where you have helmets, you have armor, you have swords, you have weapons, you're throwing things at each other, etc. Right? This is how you do battle. And the feeling for Flesh and Blood is really nice because unlike most card games where you start weak and then you build up to be strong, like Magic has a resource system, mana, Hearthstone builds up the mana, even Grand Archive, you level up and you have access to more elements. Flesh and Blood is a game where you go the opposite way. In the beginning, right, again, most decks feel this way. In the beginning, you have full health. You have all your armor, all your armaments, your equipments are like fresh. They haven't been used. So you have a lot more options. But as you progress the game, your deck gets thinner because you're burning through cards and you can't get those cards back. And then of course your deck becomes a deck of like weaker cards that are mostly used for resources and less for the actual cards themselves. But at this point you have to use it for the cards. And then you may be throwing your armor at people. You may be breaking the armor just to prevent one damage. Like you're at the end of your whole combat. And it definitely feels like the game slows down. You're edging in even 1 or 2 damage to try to end the game. And sometimes that last couple of damage in Flesh and Blood can be the hardest damage in land. So it's a really interesting card game in that perspective. I would still say because that it's still maybe 3 or 4 years old, the meta is still going to be fresh. And one of the best parts about Flesh and Blood is this kind of like cohesive story and legacy system that they built in called Living Legends. The whole idea of the Living Legends system is that they want to make sure the meta is not stale. How does Flesh and Blood solve the stale meta problem? Is that once a specific champion, hero, gets enough victories in different levels, from the local stores all the way up to like, world championship, nationals, etc. If they accrue enough points, they become a living legend, which means those cards, those heroes are banned from like official play. Now, of course, you can still play certain formats that include living legends if you want to play those. And of course, tabletop Flesh and Blood, you can do whatever you want. But for formal competition, those are banned. And this is really nice because it forces players to shift out of certain metas, certain heroes, and then use other heroes. And it also makes it kind of interesting because while the heroes are banned, right, there are multiple heroes that are of the same type. For example, there's like your berserker, if brute, I think. There's your like warrior, there's your ninjas, etc. But there's many ninjas. So even if Katsu is banned, there's other ninjas you can use, and they can still use the equipment, the cards, the other pieces of the ninja deck that if you're a player, you have accrued all this stuff. It doesn't go away. So that's kind of nice, right? So even if the hero goes away, there may be another hero of the same class in the future that really you would like to use, and all of your cards are still viable. So that to me is such great. And think about the history of this. Like, these heroes are now in something called Living Legend. Everyone knows why. Like for example, first year, Katsu wins all the tournaments. He's just too good, and that's why he goes into Living Legend. It really reminds me of the kind of like cohesive history building of Legend of the Five Rings, actually. So very similar things like that. So that's why I like Flesh and Blood. And let's talk about collectability. Flesh and Blood has such good collectability. Cold foils, they were the first to invent a new type of foiling that doesn't bend, but really has nice highlighting for the cards. And of course, Magic the Gathering stole this and then did it very poorly. I mean, the etched foils of Magic the Gathering in no way is a good comparison to the cold foils from Flesh and Blood. And Grand Archive recently has done Quicksilver foiling, which is very similar to the cold foiling, and it is a pretty good rendition of that foiling type. But again, you have to give homage to the original Flesh and Blood for creating cold foils. Okay, so without further ado, you guys probably are expecting this already, but number 1 is going to be Grand Archive. Yay! Yep. So of course, my favorite game, that's the alternative I've chosen to put my time and money into, is Grand Archive. So basically, look, the reality is this: Fab and GA are very close in the top 2 spots for me personally, and the reason is because I think they're just same and different. They're same in that they are both good alternatives to Magic players and Magic in general, but they're different in the sense that they tailor to 2 different types of people. Flesh and Blood looks at the whole perspective as a new kind of game, and Grand Archive seeks to basically have a combination of Magic the Gathering with other pieces that people really like about Magic, for example, Commander. So what does Grand Archive do here? Grand Archive runs the general Magic concept, right? It has creatures, it has spells, it has sorcery, instant, it has other things that are very familiar to Magic players, right? And all the phases, graveyard, etc., exile. But it also adds this extra element that a lot of Magic players really love, which is called Commander. So you have a commander, if you will, for your deck that you can deck out and give more gear to, and from a wish board. So it's really nice in that aspect. The other part of this too is for any Magic player, right? They are very familiar with the whole concept of, for example, like the creatures having a power toughness that resets at the end of every single turn. These are concepts that a lot of Magic players really like. Magic players also love the stack. They love the interaction that you can have between 2 players where somebody can cast a spell, somebody can cast a spell that kind of like does something and then basically makes the first spell fizzle, and then you could of course counter that. And that part of Magic is one of, I think, the most important and most fun element of Magic, and that's kept in Grand Archive as well. Lastly, like I said, for all the other games, it's a new game, so the meta is undetermined, and it's still people are figuring things out. And we've recently had a small little expansion of 90 cards, and I can tell you already, the meta is completely shifted because of these 90 cards. And that is saying a lot. So the creator behind the game is putting a lot of good effort into the game. They're really thinking about how to make Grand Archive a good game for all players, and then continue to keep the game fresh. Now, the collectability side of Grand Archive is really interesting too. So Grand Archive seeks to, of course, have high collectability, but the way they're doing it is they're making the cards that are very easy to acquire normally also the most rare possible. For example, the champions that we talked about, all the champions are available for all players. There's basically no player that ever needs to go out of their way to go get a champion. You could essentially get them. They're in the bulk bins. I will give you any champion you want, I think, except maybe Merlin level 3, because that one's like super rare. But any champion, basically, I can give it to you for free. However, the most rare versions of some of the cards in this game are also the champions. So you can get like collector's ultra rare version of, for example, Lorraine. And these are serialized with golden signatures, with texturized fronts, full art or whatever, borderless, full art, all the fancy stuff put into it. And these cards can go, for example, that free Lorraine I can give you, it can go all the way up if you buy the most collectible version, up to like thousands of dollars, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 for a Lorraine. So that's the kind of range we're talking about here. So really this game is built for both collectors and players. In fact, the owners of this card game is so confident in that they actually dictate that they want a balance of 50-50, 50% players and 50% collectors in their card game. And while I don't think that's perfectly there yet, I do think they're striving towards that number constantly every single time. So there you go. There's 5 different alternatives for Magic the Gathering. If you're a player who's tired of Magic Gathering right now, here are 5 games that you should just look into. Try, maybe buy a couple starter decks, go play with some friends, see what kind of things are supported in your local game store, something that you can get a community to go around if you're tired of Magic the Gathering. I think all of these are probably really good alternatives, and of course for different players. But that's going to do it for me for today. Mark Solo Games. If you like content like this, let me know, and I can do more kind of contents like this. Maybe next video I'll focus on the digital alternatives to Magic the Gathering Arena or something. So there's that. Mark Solo Games. I'm out. Stay classy.